I couldn't leave without one more story from Indiana. Guess it's my trademark, right? So once when they were kids, my father and his brother found a bicycle. Now, it was an old, rusted out thing with bent rims and no tires at all, but you've got to understand, money was always tight in my dad's family, so these two boys could not have been more excited. At last, they had a bicycle, the thing they hadn't dared hope for, certainly not even for a birthday or Christmas gift where they'd be lucky to get a practical gift like a new pair of shoes or a notebook for school. No, a bicycle was beyond their hopes. But there it was, abandoned in the dirt by the side of the narrow country lane that led to their house. They asked their mother if they could keep it. She looked it up and down and then in her usual gruff way said, "Sure, but it's no good without tires." And she went back to slicing the endless buckets of potatoes that she prepared each day to be turned into French fries for the local drive-in theater. So in the barn, the two boys took an old garden hose, and with the ingenuity known only to children, they cut it into two pieces, and then they wrapped it around the rims of the bicycle wheels. And before you knew it, there was my Uncle Mike shakily riding that bike around and around on the dirt patch in their front yard. "Ma, Ma," they yelled, and she came to the door, took one look at the triumphant faces of her children, that pitiful garden hose serving as tires, and she burst into tears. Her boys deserved better. Now, it had been a hard few years, there was no doubt. My dad's father had had a stroke the year before. Everyone in their church, not a Unitarian Universalist one, clucked their tongues. "It's too bad," they said, "that God had seen fit for that to happen." My grandmother got busy praying even harder than usual. She was determined that her children would be cleansed in body and spirit. So on the advice of her pastor, she reluctantly but regularly whipped them. As she said, "I'm doing this for the sins I don't know about, but God does." My grandfather, a bricklayer by trade, was now physically unable to work much, and that meant there wasn't much money or food. Their shabbily constructed house sat by itself deep in rural Indiana, and when winter came, the water pipes, which had been laid too close to the surface of the ground, would freeze. And to get the nearest available water, my 8-year-old dad and his younger brother would have to go out into the bitter cold and, get this, they'd harness a goat to a cart, and then they'd lead the goat up this steep hill to my great-grandparents' house, where they'd fill up 3 buckets full of water, put them on the cart, and then traipse back down the hill again. Now, as you can imagine, neither my father nor my uncle nor the goat enjoyed this process. My father always talks with kind of curiosity and astonishment about how mean this goat was, and I'm like, "Dad, can you really blame the goat? I mean, what a life." So anyway, one winter brought with it this terrible blizzard, as will happen in Indiana. The power went out, the pipes were, of course, frozen, and that goat had somehow gotten out of his pen, never to be seen again. And despite all these concerns, all my dad could think of was how the members of their church would say that it was somehow his family's fault. "Why has God done this to us?" he wailed. "What did we do to deserve this?" Now, my grandfather, who had rarely spoken since the stroke, gave him a long look and wrinkled his forehead. He cleared his throat, shook his head, and said, "Enough." There was a long pause while the family stared at him. "Enough," he said again. "We go to the sea." And that's exactly what they did. They filled one suitcase with most of their meager belongings, and the 4 children and 2 adults, none of whom had ever laid eyes on the sea before, set out in a rusted-out car that had seen better days. They drove for 3 days and 3 nights. They drove out of the snow and ice and spent literally every last dollar they had saved eating at roadside restaurants along the way. And at the end of that journey, there was the sea. And my dad never knew why his father took them to the sea at that moment. Maybe he'd always wanted to go, and maybe it seemed like it was the perfect place to escape to when things had gotten too bad. Whatever the reason, it ended up being the right thing to do. To hear my dad tell it, that first moment when the blue expanse of sea opened before him was breathtaking. But it was more than just a feast for the eyes. Camped out at the warmth of the seaside over the next several days, away from the voices that had caused so many wounds, the family began to heal from what they had been through. Now, their struggles didn't magically go away, and neither did the scars from their wounds, but with each turn of the tide, my dad said something inside him began to smooth over. And he decided that no God who could be part of this ocean, majestic and teeming with life and glimmering darkness and wonder, that God would not have caused his father's stroke or the terrible blizzard or been complicit in whatever had happened to that poor goat. My father returned to the sea many times, and so I grew up with the sea as a place of healing to return to again and again, as I have over the past few difficult weeks. And looking out over the waves, I see all the pain and possibility of the world we live in. For the vast, mysterious ocean filled with mountain ranges whose heights surpass the Alps, with volcanoes and 10-foot-tall tube worms, remains more unknown and shrouded in secrecy than Mars or Venus. Friday, of course, was Earth Day, a time when events all over the world remind us to care for our Earth through support for environmental protection. And that got me thinking not just about how we treat the Earth, as important as that is, but about our relationship to it at our deepest level. And so I thought of that story of my father and the sea, for to me it gestures toward the concept of religious naturalism, a theological option that you may find meaningful. The word naturalism points to this world, most famously perhaps through those who have found meaning through nature, such as Henry David Thoreau, though this idea of naturalism can be expanded to include anything that is in this world, humanity itself, this universe, in fact, for it is all natural in some sense, except for Vegemite. I lived for a summer in Australia, and I would deem Vegemite as unnatural. Fermented yeast extract that you spread on toast, that's unnatural, but... That aside, naturalism is concerned with finding ways to make meaning of the universe around us. And the religious part comes into play in how we choose to hold that meaning sacred, how we lift up the moments of our lives, our exchanges with the world, into something that takes us beyond the mundane. In its own way, my father's experience with the sea was one of those moments. And for me, thinking about something like the mysterious ocean serves as an entry into thinking of ourselves, for we humans are also shrouded in mystery. We act and think and feel for reasons that are often as unknown as they are known. A religious naturalist perspective certainly doesn't discount our ability to reason, but it acknowledges the full spectrum of our humanity in that we are also irrational creatures, often acting out of pain and not even aware of it. Too often we don't take the time to fully heal from our wounds, and that's why I say that we have to intentionally make space for that healing to happen. Now, we've all been wounded at some point. It might be from our family or a neighbor or our partner or someone who said or showed that we weren't worthy in some way. It might have been from the loss of people from our lives. It might be from illness or job loss or anxiety about what tomorrow may bring. It might be from the larger oppressive social systems that punish people for being their authentic selves. Many of us still carry those painful wounds. And of course, every day there are opportunities for fresh lacerations. So some will ask, shouldn't we just move on? Is healing really the work of Unitarian Universalism? Wouldn't our time be better utilized out in the world actively fighting for justice? And I get that. In this infinite, all those self-help books out there, the selfies and beauty products, the idea of spiritual healing can seem like another trip on the self-indulgence train. I'm not actually knocking self-indulgence. I think we need it every now and then. But like it or not, we do live in this world. We are at times wounded by it, and we need to heal in order to do the important work of changing the world for the better. The seeds of this idea have been with us throughout our history as Unitarian Universalists. Think of those early Unitarians in New England who rejected the idea that only some people were worthy of salvation, and instead said that people can find salvation through having a healthy relationship with others and the world itself. Transcendentalists like Thoreau took it further. Dan Harper says that he was concerned with the totally interconnected universe, including the biosphere and everything in it, the sun and the moon, by extension other stars and planets and other possible biospheres, and all non-organic aspects of the universe. Thoreau finds religious wonder in and draws meaning from the universe through close and careful examination of the organisms, processes, and events of this world. What a healing balm this concept was and is, soothing those wounds that came from waiting for salvation from something external, when salvation is to be found in our relationship with the world around us, right here. Meanwhile, Universalists were offering the idea that if God is a loving God, then that means all humanity is connected to God's love. And the natural extension of this idea is that the world around is one created of love, a place for us to reconnect with the love that is as much a part of all of us as our DNA. Thus, our radical faith tradition offered healing right here in this world for the many wounds that came from the fear of not being good enough, not being worthy enough, fears that still plague people today. Our tradition says that when we stand on the shore of life, the message of the eternally breaking waves is, you are loved. And this message, this idea that you are loved, is one that fuels us as Unitarian Universalists. It's our message to the world that no matter who you are, no matter how you identify, you are loved. Now, we have to work to make people feel this truth, but we also need to truly be in touch with it ourselves, because we can't spread this message if we don't believe it. And that's why healing is necessary for us to be able to do the work of Unitarian Universalism, transforming ourselves and the world for the better. It's necessary to heal our wounds, because if we don't, we can too easily become engulfed in a tidal wave of isolation. It's necessary to heal our wounds so that our hearts can be open to the wonder of the vast universe, far more vast than even the oceans I rhapsodized about, a universe which cradles us in the multitudinous possibilities of love. And when we are able to truly stand in this space of awe, when we are able to be connected in both our joys and our pain, then we build that beloved community. The scars from the wounds will remain, but when we work for justice, we will wash them clean with the love that pours over us like waves. So how do we begin to do this work of healing? Well, religious naturalists would say that we begin by letting the reality of our experience in. We must learn to hold each other's pain and acknowledge that our work as a community involves healing both our own and others' wounds. And when we have worked to heal our own wounds, our skills at healing the macro wounds of war and torture and poverty and racism and so on, those skills will become more proficient. So I'd like to tell you that when my dad's family came home from their time at the sea, everything changed. But it didn't. They still continued to be involved with a church that did more to hold them down than lift them up. They struggled financially. They struggled with ideas about how much discipline was appropriate for their children. But there is one thing that they carried home with them from that time at the seaside. So remember that bicycle, rusted out bicycle that had seen better days. Well, one day after finding that bike, my father and uncle were home alone when a large Sears and Roebuck truck pulled into their driveway. Now they watched, mouths agape, as the driver didn't simply turn around in their driveway and leave, but actually parked the truck and got out. "I've got a delivery," he said. The boys shook their head. "You've got the wrong house." The driver looked at his paper. "No," he said. He opened the doors of the truck and brought out 2 brand new, shining Schwinn bicycles. Both boys stood still, frozen. Finally, my dad spoke. "Those can't be for us, mister. We're going to get in a lot of trouble if you leave them here." The driver shrugged. "This is the address," he said, and then he drove off. So those boys sat down on the stoop and stared at those bicycles just a few feet away, and they didn't dare touch them. But as 10, then 20, then 30 minutes passed, they began to imagine those bikes were theirs. They knew, of course, it had to be a mistake, but for those precious moments, they could feel like it was possible. When their mother got home, she saw the boys planted on the front stoop, the pristine bicycles a few feet away. "Don't you like them?" she asked. They looked at her. "Whose are they?" my uncle said. She laughed. "Who do you think? You can't ride that old contraption with the hose anymore." "How did you pay for them?" my dad asked. She shook her head. "Don't worry about that." And then, of course, joy overflowed as the 2 boys jumped onto those bikes. And even though my grandmother didn't answer the question of how those bikes were paid for, I think I figured out part of the answer. Those bikes were paid for in hope. Oh, it's not a practical form of payment. It's not the solution for anybody's financial woes. But once in a while, when it's great enough, when it's important enough, when it matters enough, we can change our hope to a sort of temporary currency. And there is no doubt that my grandmother brought that lesson back from the family's time at the sea. There is no doubt that that expanse of never-ending blue was in her heart when she dared to order a dose of hope from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And so for this church, let me wish for a moment for you to have that moment that my father and his family had so many years ago. Let me wish for all of you to be present on the shore, facing the awe of what lies before you. Let me wish for all of you to move into the sea, feeling the water upon your skin, the healing water made up of your tears, your hope, your commitment to life. Let me wish for all of you to know the feeling of coming out renewed, to hold a shell to your ear and hear the words, "You are loved," echoing back at you. We don't forget the past. We acknowledge the goat is still gone, somewhere. That blizzard is somewhere still raging on. Somewhere those angry, misguided voices still chatter on. But we sail forward into the future together, if not always together in body, certainly in spirit, doing the work of love in all its infinite possibilities. May that wish not just be a wish. May it be the reality of today, tomorrow, and forever.